Sean lived on the wild side. Every sign stating, "Do not enter," was just an open invitation to find out what people were hiding. He was a natural-born explorer who was always up for the next adventure. His best friend Luke was adventurous, but he certainly had his limits. There were places Sean wanted to explore that Luke had refused. There was adventurous, and then there was just stupid. The coronavirus pandemic had affected them in different ways. Where it made Luke more cautious, it apparently only led to more boredom and wishes to have fun in Sean. That wasn't all it did. Luke was a non-essential worker. He was tight for cash, which led to a problem for him. It was Sean's birthday, and he didn't have the money to get his friend a gift. Luckily, what Sean really wanted didn't cost a dime. Unluckily for Luke, it was pure recklessness. Sean wanted to break in and explore the new abandoned Lady Gertrude's Asylum. It was supposedly one of the most haunted places in America and happened to only be a town over from where they lived. Sean had wanted to go for years, but Luke had always refused. Now Sean was asking him to go with him for his birthday, and Luke had reluctantly agreed. It was a bad idea, but what was he supposed to do? He didn't want to let Sean down. The night of Sean's birthday, they made their way over to the decrepit building. On the way, Sean kept gushing about the different legends. They say the head doctor, Dr. Myers, performed botched lobotomies. It ended up killing dozens of people. They say you can still see the doctor in his office, sorting through his paperwork, and the patients. They're said to roam the halls of the asylum, lost forever. The conditions were horrible. The amount of people that died from preventable disease was astronomical, Sean explained. Luke didn't find this nearly as exciting as apparently Sean did. Truthfully, the legends just made him sad. Still, it was Sean's birthday, so he put on the pretend smile. The massive building slowly came into view. It certainly looked creepy. Parts of the building seeming to be crumbled away and graffiti warning about death to anyone who entered. The front door was chained shut. Sean had brought bolt cutters for this reason. They turned off the car and made their way up the crumbling stairs. Sean broke the chains, throwing the bolt cutters lazily to the side of the door. As they pushed the door open, the smell of dirt and decay met their noses, leaving them in a coughing fit. Once they were able to compose themselves, they pulled out their flashlights so they could see through the pitch black hallways. The place was creepy, with broken wheelchairs thrown about and old medical equipment encased in cobwebs. Luke had no desire to touch anything. Sean, on the other hand, was opening doors and exploring every crevice he could. Sean walked into one of the rooms when the door shut behind him. Luke panicked. "Sean, can you hear me? Are you okay?" He yelled as he tried to open the door. It was jammed. "I'm fine." He could hear Sean's voice. "Wow, did that scare me?" he said as if it was the most exciting thing ever. "There's another door across the room. It looks like it leads to another hall. Just meet me at Dr. Myers' office. That's the room with the big double doors on the 3rd floor. It should be hard to miss." Luke wanted to refuse, but he feared that he didn't have much choice in the matter. They couldn't get that door open. They would have to go on their own. Luke slowly made his way through the halls, looking for stairs of any kind. He felt like he had been walking forever when he heard a shuffling sound coming from around the corner. His blood turned cold, and he began to shake, causing the light from his flashlight to bounce around. He took a deep breath and swiftly walked towards the sound. He let out a scream as he ran into a girl about his age. She screamed as well, then put her hand on her chest as if to calm her heartbeat. "You scared the hell out of me," she explained. "You scared the hell out of me," he responded back. They both took a moment to calm their breathing before Luke began to question her. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I got lost," she said. "I was with my friends when I made a wrong turn, and now I can't find them. I'm Lexi, by the way." "I'm Luke," he replied, and same here. I'm supposed to meet my friend on the 3rd floor, but I have no idea where any of these stairwells are. Lexi gave a little smile. Well, I can help you with that. I just came from the 4th floor. I'll show you the stairs if I can stay with you. This place gives me the creeps, and I do not want to be alone, she said. Luke agreed, secretly happy to have someone with him as he made his way through the asylum. They took off, Lexi leading the way. You don't seem like you really want to be here, Lexi said, making conversation. I don't, but I'm here as a favor for a friend, Luke replied. Well, we're in the same boat because neither of us want to be here, she said. She turned a corner and brought him to a stairwell. Here you go. The floors are numbered, so you shouldn't have any problems finding the 3rd floor. Aren't you coming? He asked. She shook her head. I'm going to try to find the exit. I've got people waiting on me. It was nice to meet you, Luke, she said with a kind smile. Same here, he said as he walked into the stairwell, and Lexi turned around and walked in the direction of the exit. Luke made it to the 3rd floor and immediately found the 2 double doors labeled Dr. Meyer's office. He had another mini fright as he nearly ran into Sean as he opened the doors and walked in. Sean, he said, relieved. Sean looked up and smiled. Any paranormal activity? Sean looked hopeful. Nope, replied Luke. Damn, me neither. I guess this place is a dud. I did find some old paperwork on the patients, he said. Luke followed Sean behind a large desk when an old picture on the wall captured his attention. It showed he assumed was Dr. Myers, with well over 100 patients, each with their names listed at the bottom of the photo. It was old, at least 50 years old. He scanned the sad faces when one made him stop in shock. He counted, 4th row, 36 from the left. It was undoable. He knew that face. He looked at the name printed at the bottom of the photograph, Alexis Young. He felt cold. Lexi had been lost longer than he realized. This happened fairly recently at a wildlife management area near my hometown. I won't reveal its exact location, but it's in a densely wooded region near the Connecticut-Rhode Island border. A favorite spot of me and my friends was a lake in the center of the wildlife management area. We called it the Hole because of its purported deepness. There was a small cluster of picnic tables on the lake's far side where we'd party at night when it was warm outside. For the most part, I had a lot of wonderful memories associated with the Hole, where I had my first hookup, caught my biggest fish, and even celebrated a few birthdays. After that fateful night, however, those memories became meaningless. Not only was the Hole our hangout, but we used it to stash our liquor, tobacco, and other party favors. On this particular night, there were 5 of us: Rob, my best friend, Tanner, who lived down the street from me, Uma, a foreign exchange student we befriended, Pam, my cousin, and myself. Earlier that day, Rob and Tanner visited the Hole to hide a bottle of vodka we planned to drink that night, saying they stashed it in the crevice of a boulder along the trail that took us to the picnic tables. Our plans changed unexpectedly when Pam said we could drink at her house. All we had to do was retrieve the bottle, which was easier said than done at 10 p.m. Uma and Pam stayed with the car, while Rob, Tanner, and myself went to go get the bottle. Despite its relatively secluded location, the trails were maintained pretty routinely and appeared to have been worked on earlier today. After about 15 minutes of walking, we approached the trail's first junction, which either took you around the lake or deeper into the woods. "This doesn't feel right," Tanner exclaimed as we all came to a halt. "We didn't come this far. Did we pass it?" Rob and I exchanged glances with mixed expressions of bewilderment and frustration before he replied, "No, Tanner, we've used that boulder to hide shit multiple times before. How do you not know where it is by now?" Rob replied in a tone that sounded like he was asking a question. "You're even the one who picked the damn spot." Tanner shrugged. "Everything just looks different at night, I guess." Rob grumbled something before he resumed walking. I couldn't quite hear what he said, but it seemed to anger Tanner. They'd been edgy toward each other all night, so I assumed they had a previous argument they hadn't settled. I'm sure the night's hot, humid conditions also didn't necessarily help lighten the mood. Let's just find it and get back, I added, trying to keep the peace. We've only been out here 15 minutes, and I'm already matted with sweat. We walked in silence for another couple of minutes until something caught Tanner's attention. Look at this, Tanner said, briefly stepping out of the headlamp's light and re-emerging from the darkness, brandishing a small orange chainsaw. Why would you leave something like this just chilling alongside the trail? Probably because they're coming back tomorrow to finish whatever they're working on, Rob said quickly, wincing when Tanner started aimlessly waving the chainsaw in the air. Just put it down, dude. You're wasting time. Tanner scoffed at Rob's comment and resumed walking. Nobody's gonna fuck with us if we got one of these, Tanner said, part jokingly and part seriously. Do you even know how to use it? Rob asked condescendingly as him and I struggled to keep up with Tanner, who was lavishing over the newfound sense of invincibility he seemingly acquired from discovering the chainsaw. Tanner didn't respond and did a slow 360-degree spin as he stuck the chainsaw out and lazily swung it horizontally. You're gonna fucking kill someone, Rob barked, stopping dead in his tracks during Tanner's graceful chainsaw spin. Despite being well over 20 paces from where he stood, I could hear Rob mumble things like it's always something with him, or he always has to find something to sidetrack us, but didn't say anything. Knowing how arguing was a huge component of Rob and Tanner's volatile friendship, Tanner was definitely the most immature out of us, where Rob was very subtle, yet temperamental. I hoped retrieving the bottle would be simple and seamless, so we could get back to the car, out of this sticky, heavy humidity, without Rob and Tanner engaging in another round of arguments. Rob and Tanner had mixed reactions when we reached the boulder where the vodka was supposedly stored. Tanner stopped rather abruptly while Rob continued walking toward the boulder. This doesn't feel right, Tanner said as he surveyed our surroundings. I really don't think this is the one we left it in, bro. Tanner and I watched Rob encircle the boulder before stepping up and inspecting a side that was obstructed from my view. Rob adjusted his headlamp a few times, shifting his stance and arms for nearly 2 minutes before he finally stepped back and turned towards us. It's not here, Rob said flatly. I told you, Tanner snapped back, dropping the chainsaw, whose clank echoed throughout the forest. We hid the bottle. To fucking gather, Rob barked, anger and frustration growing in each of his words as he turned to face Tanner. If that's where we hid it, why isn't it there anymore? Tanner quickly asked. I don't know. Maybe someone took it, Rob replied while he started walking toward Tanner. Or maybe because that's not where we fucking left it. How do you not even remember? Are you really that dumb? Is your brain really that fried already from the barrage of shit you smoke, snort, or pop? That was the last I heard before zoning the two out while they bickered. I walked over to the boulder and inspected it myself, carefully walking around it, before beginning to thoroughly inspect the crevice where Rob claimed to have stashed the bottle. There was indeed nothing inside, as Rob claimed. I didn't doubt Rob's story, figuring Tanner must have been too stoned to notice at the time, and some other kids took it for themselves. We weren't the only ones who hung out here, and have previously come across other kids' stashes in the hiding spots we used. I was annoyed upon realizing we didn't have anything to drink tonight, and dreaded how the girls would react upon learning the news. My train of thought was disrupted by Rob, uttering something in a screeching shriek, to which Tanner responded with his own banshee-like screams. I quickly ran over and separated them, unable to precisely decipher what they were fighting about, since they were shouting over each other. While I didn't know what escalated their argument, I could tell looking at their faces they were both seething. Upon separating them, I had to push against Rob, who still tried coming at Tanner, who started stomping back down the path. The last thing I heard Tanner say was, "Fuck you both," before a quick scrapping and metallic thump broke out, followed by Tanner's gasp, getting cut short by a squishy crunch thump. I felt Rob's body stiffen as he stopped trying to force himself forward. Leaning back, the fury anger in Rob's eyes was now replaced by shock and sheer terror, his trembling jaw hanging open, as the expression on his face seemed frozen in disbelief from whatever he stared at over my shoulder. When I looked behind me, my headlamp light shone on Tanner, lying face down on the ground, his twitching limbs sprawling out in different directions, a reddish-beige tip protruding from the back of Tanner's head, around which I quickly noticed a pool of blood was forming. I detached myself from Rob as we both stared in disbelief for a few seconds, before hurrying over towards Tanner's limp body. "What happened?" I started asking frantically to Rob, whose stunned wide-eyed expression hadn't changed. It was an accident," Rob managed to sputter out after a few seconds, his eyes unable to move off Tanner. He tipped over the chainsaw and he fell." A heavy knotty feeling formed in my stomach when I realized the tip jutting out from the back of Tanner's head was a jagged edge of a small tree stump that must have been cut down earlier today. Tanner tipped over the chainsaw he was playing with, lost his footing, and landed directly onto the stump's pointed tip face first. "We have to get help," I said, facing Rob, who was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Unable to speak, Rob shakily nodded his head in response to my comment as his eyes remained fixed on Tanner's motionless body. "Stay with him. Can you do that?" I quickly asked Rob, who lightly gestured with his head that he would. "I'm gonna run back to the car, call for help, and let the girls know what happened. I'll be back soon as possible." I didn't wait for Rob to respond and bolted back down the path, trying to run as fast as my feet would take me. Amid navigating the dark, rocky trail, my heart pounded and my mind raced with the recurring image of Tanner's stiff, twitching body, while the reality of what just happened, along with the drastic shift of events this night took, struggled to set in with me. About halfway back to the parking lot, I stopped alongside the trail and vomited profusely, forcing myself to take a few slow, deep breaths before resuming my sprint. I was able to reach the parking lot in under 10 minutes, finding Pam and Uma still sitting in the car, both fixated on their phones. The girls were startled when I frantically pounded on the glass, gesturing for them to step out of the vehicle. They seemed hesitant at first, probably thinking I was pulling some sort of prank, until they noticed the genuine fear and panic in my eyes. I quickly called the police, saying there was an accident, and gave them our location. Pam and Uma were now visibly concerned, and asking what was happening soon as I hung up with the cops. There's been an accident," I stammered, realizing my body visibly shaking while I struggled to catch my breath. "Tanner's hurt. He's hurt bad." "Where's Rob?" Pam asked urgently, to which I noted he stayed back with Tanner. "We have to try to move him," I said while motioning for the three of us to head back down the trail. "Cops won't be here for another 30-40 minutes. We have to try to get him back to the parking lot." The girls started asking what exactly happened to Tanner as I took them down the trail. I was so focused on getting back to Tanner and Rob, I didn't answer them at first. I eventually spewed a vague response, simply stating, "He fell and is bleeding really bad," in between short gasps of air, while trying to maintain a steady running pace. We returned to the spot where I left Tanner and Rob, but neither were anywhere to be seen. I quickly noticed the stump Tanner fell on that was still encompassed by a fresh coating of blood, which stained the ground. After pointing it out and catching my breath, I finally had a chance to explain what actually happened to the girls, who responded with disturbed expressions of disgust and alarm. "So, where are they now, then?" Pam blurted, yelling at me like I was to blame for the incident. "I don't know. I told Rob to stay with Tanner, so maybe he managed to start moving him back to the car," I replied with a blatant absence of confidence in my voice, trying to remain ignorant of the inevitability that Tanner had more than likely been killed from his fall. Before anyone could say anything else, the sound of shuffling footsteps accompanied with a teeth-gritting, squishy crunch sound came from down the path. In the darkened section my headlamp's light couldn't reach. The three of us froze and stared intently toward where the noise came from, the footsteps appearing to get louder. I eventually started making out a human-shaped figure in the darkness that appeared to be taking staggered, stumbling steps, like someone who was deathly impaired. When the figure stepped into my headlamp's light, all three of us released terrified gasps and yelps. A gaping fist-sized hole was in the center of Tanner's mangled, bloodied face, where he had been impaled by the stump, his head hanging limp on his neck and bobbling side to side, looking like a broken toy. He was completely nude with blood streaking down the front of his torso, while his arms remained completely motionless and swayed lazily in conjunction with his discombobulated footsteps. That popping, crunching sound emitted every time any one of Tanner's bodily joints shifted, his skin now deathly corpse-like pale tone and covered with mottled grayish-blue patches. As much as I wanted to believe Tanner was somehow alive, it was abundantly clear something wasn't right. I heard Pam and Uma begin whimpering as Tanner took his lurching steps towards us, stopping when he was about 9 or 10 paces from where we stood. There was a tense stretch of seconds before I shakily uttered Tanner's name, after which his back made an abrupt arch, unnaturally bending backwards 90 degrees as a popping crunch emanated throughout our vicinity. Tanner's swift movements made Pam and Uma shriek, after which he started racing toward where we stood. Our fight or flight instincts activated, the three of us swiftly pivoting and bolting back down the trail. I was convinced I heard that popping, crunching, and Tanner's wobbling footsteps following close behind us in our dash back to the parking lot. I remained focused on what I could see in front of me until we reached the car. Pam and Uma were crying hysterically as I pivoted and shined my headlamp back down the trail to see we were no longer being chased, but couldn't shake off the smothering feeling something was still watching us within the forest impenetrable darkness. We all instinctively scrambled toward the car, but paused when Pam asked about Rob. In the ensuring silence that materialized when she asked this question, we picked up the sound of a soft whimpering that came from the cluster of nearby bushes. Shining my headlamp in that direction, I immediately noticed a figure making subtle movements, and quickly realized it was Rob. We found him behind the brush on his knees with his face buried in his hands. He was sobbing and frantically rocking back and forth. His clothes were covered in sweat, mud, and what appeared to be blood. "Rob," I said in a soft but shaky voice while warily approaching him. "We gotta go, bro. Let me help you to the car." "It's right." Rob started repeatedly mumbling the same phrases. "I don't know what I saw. It was so real, and I keep seeing it. I couldn't stop seeing it." When I extended a hand out to Rob, he became still and silent for a few seconds before lowering his hands, which I realized were coated in blood, and lifted his head. His eyes were missing, and 2 empty black pits were now in their place, with blood streaking down his face's entire front side. Anything else I might have heard were drowned out in the girl's onslaught of frantic, horrific screams. Uma dove into the car, while Pam raced down the road in a full-on panic. I just stood completely frozen, unable to say or do anything but stare at Rob's disfigured, bloodied, eyeless face. Rob has been institutionalized since that night. I visit him a few times, but trying to communicate is a waste of time, since all he does is cry or mumble gibberish. I tried asking what he saw that night, but he breaks out into hysterics. Only once did Rob utter something understandable, and what he said still sends chills down my spine. "You can't hear the crunching?" The last time I visit, Rob started violently smashing his head against the wall, after which I was asked not to return. Tanner's body was never found, despite a thorough search and investigation. Pam and I were never really the same after that, and Uma moved out of town shortly, never telling us where her family relocated. I never returned to visit that wildlife management area, and ever since visiting Rob last, Started hearing shuffling footsteps accompanied with a squishy crunching sound. It always happened at night. The noises came from outside and instantly reminded me of the movements Tanner's limp, mangled body made whenever he moved, which is what I visualize whenever I hear them and close my eyes. I never saw anything on the few instances I've mustered up the courage to check, and nobody else seems to hear the eerie sounds. It's been sporadically happening in the months since I last saw Rob, but something recently changed about this inexplicable phenomenon that prompted me to share this tale. Lately, these noises are coming from inside. I watch a lot of YouTube. In fact, it essentially replaced TV for me at this point. I think that might be the case for a lot of people. During one particular boring night, I was surfing through my subscriptions, but couldn't really find anything interesting to watch. That's when I decided to check out the trending page. Now, I didn't really expect anything much out of it. I assumed that there would be some Jimmy Fallon, BuzzFeed, that kind of stuff. Not really my cup of tea, in all honesty. However, I did end up finding something rather intriguing. About 10 videos down, there was a thumbnail that grabbed my attention. It was a black symbol over a plain white background, and was 1 minute and 55 seconds in length. The symbol itself was really intricate and hard to describe, so I won't even attempt it. All I know is that I'd never recognized it before. The title was even more interesting. It was in Russian and translated to "A Signal, Attempt 34. The channel name was just a mess of letters and numbers. No video description either. But here's where shit started getting really weird. The video itself had no views. Well, to put it more accurately, it didn't actually have a view counter. It was just empty space where it should have indicated how many views it had. Obviously, this made me immensely curious, so I clicked on it. I jumped as soon as the video loaded up. It really wasn't anything too disturbing, just rather unexpected. There was a man standing in an empty white room, wearing what looked to be some kind of greenish, futuristic-looking spacesuit. I put "man" in quotations because while it did closely resemble a human, there were also a lot of things that simply weren't right about him. First of all, his eyes were too big. They were brown and oval-shaped, just like a regular person's could be, but they took up too much damn room on his face. Second of all, he was pale. Way too pale. In fact, his skin was essentially translucent. The words coming out of his mouth were also rather peculiar. It sounded like Russian, but very broken. Now, I'm not a native speaker, but I've heard enough of it to comprehend that this guy wasn't either. I made an attempt to try and take down what he was saying in order to translate it later, but there was no way in hell that I was going to be able to. His words were simply too fast and too unclear. Eventually, I just clicked off of it. It must have been some kind of weird glitch, I thought. It was probably just some obscure Russian show that leaked onto YouTube somehow. In any case, I didn't really think about it too much. That was until the next week. After work, I hopped on YouTube again and started doing my routine browsing. I watched the videos in my subscription box before going back onto the trending section. However, the strange video was still there. Well, not the exact same video, but it had the same thumbnail. The title was no different. It was in Chinese this time. I translated it and it came out to "A Signal, Attempt 35. This was officially getting weird. Again, there was no video description and no view count. I watched the video through, which was only about 1 minute and 43 seconds long this time, but it was just the same guy talking in the same tone, this time in broken sounding Chinese. I called my friend who actually speaks Chinese and told him to go watch the video. About an hour later, he messaged me back, saying that there isn't any video in the trending section that matches my description. I was a bit shocked by this, but still wanted to figure out what was going on, so I downloaded the video and sent it to him. The next day, I turned on my phone to a bombardment of angry text messages from my friend. Apparently, when he downloaded the attachment I sent to him, His computer crashed instantly and wouldn't turn back on for hours. When it finally did, the colors and text on his desktop and applications were now distorted. There were also these obscure-looking symbols now splitting in between random words on his internet pages and in his directories. However, none of his credit cards had been accessed, so he eventually just accepted it when I tried to explain that I genuinely did not know what was going on. I was floored at this point. I stopped watching YouTube completely for about 2 weeks. However, the curiosity kept gnawing away at me. I needed to know what the fuck this was supposed to be. I went back to the trending section and started scrolling again. This time, I found a video about 25 down. This one's title was in Spanish and translated to Aftermath 31.559 and 35.472. The thumbnail looked like the sky, except it was dark purple, and there were large, black, cylindrical objects blocking out the stars. It was also about 5 minutes long. With all expectations out the window, I clicked on it. The video began with what appeared to be a reporter on a rooftop, with astronomically tall, decimated buildings in the background. He had the same facial anomalies as the man in the spacesuit. Also, the language that he was speaking was completely unfamiliar to me. It wasn't just a broken human language, it was something else entirely. He was pointing to the cylindrical things in the sky, looking absolutely distraught. The camera panned towards them, and I could begin to make out things falling from objects. They were too distant to make out the details, but I could tell that they were flailing wildly on the way down. They were alive, for sure. There was also some sort of extremely loud humming in the distance, presumably sourced from the sky. The reporter turned back to the camera and started shouting. He abruptly ran out of the frame, and what appeared to be a soldier took his place. The guy looked extremely large and was wearing some kind of robotic military suit. He pointed at the objects in the sky and began to bark out what I assumed were some kind of orders. The video ended right there. Obviously, I had no idea what to think. I mean, what the hell was I supposed to make of this? I started searching the internet for answers, but of course there was nothing. I asked everybody I knew if they were seeing these videos in the trending section, but none of them did. The next day I went back and searched, just like I expected. I found another one of those anomalous videos. This time, the thumbnail was back to the logo that I'd seen the first 2 times. However, this time, the title was actually in English, reading, "A Signal, Attempt 36. You have to watch fully." What the fuck, I thought. Why was it different this time? Now just a regular signal, but one I had to watch? The video started off with the same man in the spacesuit from the first 2, but this time, there was also a large machine in the room with him. It looked absolutely alien to me, and I couldn't begin to fathom what it could have been used for. The man seemed to be staring at the camera, almost as if he were looking through it, at me. He eventually stepped backwards and started speaking, in broken English now. This is roughly what it comes out to. You are watching. Do not turn off, okay? This is important. He moved back towards the machine, before turning around and typing something on the control panel. I couldn't make out what it was, so I decided to inspect the machine some more instead. There was a monitor near the top of the thing, displaying some numbers in green text. It only took me a few moments to realize what it was looking at. It was my IP address. Following this revelation, the man turned around to face me again and smiled, before saying, "You will be helping. Thank you." I didn't like the way he said it one bit. That isn't even to mention his smile. It wasn't genuine. There was some kind of facade behind it. Some subtle facial movement that told me this help I was giving him was going to cost something. I clicked off the video immediately following that. I started stewing on what I had been seeing. I didn't go on YouTube during that time. There was something about all this I couldn't understand. I mean, strange looking men in spacesuits who somehow had my IP address typing things into a weird machine and footage of what appeared to be an apocalyptic event happening on another planet. I didn't even know if they were connected or not, but I really had no desire to find out. However, I decided to go back to the trending section one more time. I wasn't planning on actually watching the videos, though I just wanted to see if they were still there, and as it turns out, they were. This time, the thumbnail wasn't the logo. Instead, it was the quarantine symbol, the one they use in every zombie apocalypse movie. The title was in English again, reading, "Please watch all the way through this time. Very necessary. Danger coming." I didn't watch it. I saw some more of these pop up intermittently after that, but I just ignored them all. Eventually, they stopped showing up completely. It's been about 4 months since I saw these videos, but as far as I'm concerned, nothing strange has happened, so I think that we're in the clear. Hopefully. I still remember the first time I played Mario 64. It was back in the 90s when innovations at Epcot used to showcase tons of new cutting-edge technology before you would see it anywhere else. Most of the time, when I would go there, I wasn't too interested in what they had, but when I went in and randomly saw a video game being showcased, it was a big deal. Back then, video games did not get the notoriety they do today, so it was kind of a surprise. There were all these booths where you lined up to play the game, and I must have waited hours to do it. Every kid there was obsessed and basically had to be pulled away from the system once their time was up. Then finally, it was my turn. After playing for a few minutes, I realized it was like no other game I had ever experienced before. The sound effects, the physics, the motion, they were all so perfect, almost as if they were created just for me. Upon leaving the park that day, I thought about almost nothing else other than getting my hands on a copy of that game. Then after a few weeks, my wish was finally granted. My parents got me the game along with a Nintendo 64 console for my birthday. I couldn't have been more excited. It's funny because before that, I was always kind of an athletic kid, but once I got that system, my outdoor time severely dropped. I played constantly. When I first started playing it, it felt a little different than the one at Epcot. The sounds were a little off and the colors too, but it was hard to tell. I was so focused on the game that I forgot about it quickly. Over the coming weeks, I played through the entire game, essentially beating every level and collecting every star until I was completely done with it. However, my addiction didn't seem to end. There was still so much more to investigate after you had technically beaten the game. That was when I started researching the game's hidden Easter eggs and came across one that really intrigued me. It's the one about the star fountain outside the castle. If you walked right up to it, apparently people said you could read the words, "L is real 2024, in blurry letters. Many people thought that 2024 was the amount of stars you needed to get to unlock Luigi from the game. The mystery really intrigued me because I had passed the fountain tons of times while playing and knew exactly where it was. I just hadn't ever really looked at it that closely. So I went to check it out, but after comparing images I found online with the actual game, I couldn't ever see what everyone was talking about. I even got a dry erase marker and began methodically connecting the lines together on my TV in order to figure out what mine said. After connecting the various blurry pixels, my stomach dropped. The text on the screen spelled out, "External Hell." Before that point, I never had any fear associated with the game, so that was a major paradigm shift for me. I explained it away by saying it was probably just the angle I was standing at, and pretty much convinced myself everything was okay. Although deep down, I think it scared me enough to switch on to play other games. I mean, I was like 10 at the time. Recently though, rumors have come out that every version of Mario 64 is personalized by some sort of experimental AI created by Nintendo. Finally, after hearing this, I could explain what I had seen on the statue all those years before. So I ended up getting the old Nintendo 64 out, dusted off my Mario 64, and popped it in. I'm not even really sure why I just had to see how much deeper the rabbit hole went. I pulled up an image on my phone of the supposed Mario 64 conspiracy iceberg and just sat there playing through each and every one of them, seeing if they were real. Exploring the old castle with this new lens felt so good and brought me such joy, but nothing that I saw really seemed to tie anything together for me. There were a few odd things, but I didn't really see a bigger mystery there. So I started looking into whether there was any real world evidence. I then found an account called Show You Fun on Reddit who seemed to have been on the very same path as I was a couple weeks prior, and he had connected the dots on a worldwide conspiracy revolving around the game. The pattern apparently happened the same way every time. Someone would post on Reddit or 4chan or something like that about that they were going to start exploring their personal game to see how theirs was different than others. That person would then follow some sort of storyline that was not part of the main gameplay and would go missing shortly after. He had even included police reports of the people that were affected. One particularly disturbing story was about a user named Smiles64 who found a weird access panel by punching a brick in the wall after draining the moat around Mushroom Castle. That pathway then led him to a library where he found a book he could open. This book contained a terrifying little story about a society of people who were stranded in a village beneath the ground and were drowned by an industrialist who flooded it. The book also came with a key to open some door. What Show You Fun had put together was that this story was probably referring to the Wet Dry World level, where you could blast yourself into a little abandoned town beneath the surface. The more cases I read, the more it became obvious that each and every one of them somehow led to the Wet Dry World level. I was very intrigued, so I decided to try to contact Show You Fun by sending him a direct message. He never responded to me, and I noticed he hadn't replied to a comment in a few days. Things were getting a little spooky, I guess, but I thought it was all just part of some sort of creepypasta or ARG or some sort. There was no way this was a real thing, so I began playing through my game again and looked to see if I could find a similar storyline that would lead me to the Wet Dry World as well. I played through all of the advanced levels again while watching gameplay on YouTube and comparing it to my screen. There did seem to be a few things that seemed to be unique, but mostly colors and sound effects. Nothing that really led me anywhere. I was about to give up when I realized there was still one map I hadn't checked. Bomb Om Battlefield, the very first level. So I went to the picture frame for it and jumped into the level. I immediately started running along with the gameplay video, but then noticed something different on mine. In the video, there was just 2 Bomb buddies at the beginning that give you information about the level, but in mine, there was an additional one underneath the bridge that leads up to the mountain. I quickly ran over to it and punched it to get information. It just said, "Under the bridge, the secrets await." I had no idea what it meant, so I walked over and started messing around under the bridge, kicking and punching everything. I then discovered that you were able to grasp onto the underside of the bridge and climb across it. This was something I had never tried before, and I didn't really see a purpose for it. Then I tried letting go of the bridge and doing the ground pound move, which finally broke a little square into the ground. There was one of those cannons that shoot you across the level, which I had definitely never seen before in all my years of playing. I began getting into it and firing myself to different areas of the level, until I realized I should try firing myself off the level into the ocean, aiming the cannon to the side. I successfully launched it and flew over the edge. Mario plummeted down toward the ocean below and into a little square tunnel, which eventually led to the little abandoned town in Wet Dry World. I had been down there before when playing the regular game, but it was different now. It was almost as if it was in the past. There were a few characters with blonde hair pacing back and forth, seeming to patrol the streets. I approached one of them with a green tunic, who somewhat resembled Link from the Zelda games, and attempted to speak to him. The character did not respond. It just gazed up at me, and teardrops began to drip down his face. Then, before I knew it, Mario was surrounded by several of the little Link-looking characters. They aggressively grabbed Mario and dragged him over to a little building, then opened the door and tossed him inside. A little text box popped up and said, "The Foundation sees all." They then slammed the door and left me in mostly darkness with a few other lifeless looking characters in there. They didn't seem like they belonged in a Mario game because they were dressed modern, almost like someone from the real world. One stood there staring into a corner while another jumped in place. There was also a mirror in the back, and I walked up to it and looked into it. I noticed that in the reflection, I wasn't Mario anymore. I was a character that was dressed like me. Suddenly, I heard the sound of rushing water outside the building. I ran over to the window to look out and saw the little characters in the town running and panicking. I then gazed up into the sky and witnessed a gigantic Wario head there just floating and laughing. I ran to the door to try to open it, but nothing happened. Then the room started filling with water. I looked at the other characters and oddly, they didn't even seem worried. They just stayed in the same position they were in, as if this had happened hundreds of times before. Eventually, when the room was full enough to swim, I dove down and checked everything. Every possible way to get out, but there was nothing. That was when the really scary stuff began. As I watched Mario's health go down, I began to feel short of breath as well. I panicked when I realized I couldn't breathe. I pulled the game out and smashed it on the ground. My breath seemed to come back to me at that point, but I was really shaken up. I immediately called the cops, but the guy I spoke to basically referred me to a psychiatrist instead. Then I started noticing the black van pulling up outside my house. I must have triggered something, and now I think I am being tracked. Either way, please whatever you do not investigate the Mario 64 conspiracy. That's really all I have to say. This story was sent to me over Reddit the day before RetroGamer86 went missing. I have searched for any related post or content that he spoke about in the story, but everything seems like it's been removed. So, if you have any information on this case, please let me know, and I want everyone to remember this is a cautionary tale to make sure that you leave this thing be. Do not investigate Mario 64. My great-grandfather was part of the French army during World War I. Since he died young, I never actually got the chance to meet him. My father had always told me that he was quite a reserved man. In fact, he had essentially become a shut-in during the later stages of his life. This wasn't always the case, but I suppose war does that to a person. This trend continued on throughout the rest of my family history. My grandfather died in World War II, and my father was part of the Vietnam War. He also died recently. It was a premature one, stemming from years and years of alcohol and tobacco consumption. After the funeral reception, I visited the house I grew up in, just for old time's sake. As I walked into my old room, I found a worn-out looking journal sitting on my nightstand with a note attached to it. To Jack, I know that you've never met your great-grandfather before, and you probably don't know much about him. It's time to change that. This journal belonged to him. Open it to where I've inserted the bookmark and read until the last entry. As you go on, you may consider it to be ramblings of a madman, but I assure you that he was of sane mind when he wrote this. It's time for you to know what he really went through. This kind of thing can't be forgotten. If you're reading this, then that means I've passed on, and that's exactly how I planned this to be. I never wanted to tell you this myself. Despite the feeling of heavy melancholy weighing down on me, I decided to sit down and read the journal right there. I mean, this was essentially the last thing that my father had left me. I've translated the entries from French into English. This is what it read. December 4th, 1916. The Germans can't keep this up for much longer. I don't know when they're going to call off Verdun just yet, but I'm feeling that it must be soon. There's been too much bloodshed on both sides. I say with confidence that this battle must be coming to its demise because they're taking some of us off the front lines. Not many, but just about 30. I'm part of that 30. The Lieutenant General is directing us towards a smaller village in the extreme north. We're confused as to why anybody would try an invasion from there, since the place apparently remains in a state of perpetual blizzard. The Germans must be freezing out there. I suppose that we'll find out soon. December 5th, 1916. We arrived yesterday to a massacre. The townfolks, while not too many to begin with, have all mostly been slaughtered. The few survivors have described the attack as somewhat strange, with the enemy being nearly entirely shrouded by the snow, and the gunfire seemingly coming from everywhere. However, we've been presented with somewhat discording revelation from one of the older survivors. He claimed that the entire time they were being bombarded by bullets, the air around them seemed to be filled with an unnatural shriek. Not the wind, mind you, but the air itself. The sounds weren't traveling along, but remained stationary, as if the sources were standing right outside their homes. We don't know what to make of this, because of the uncertainty surrounding this whole situation. We can't confirm the enemy yet, but we still have a pretty good idea as to who it is. They may be trying to draw troops away from Verdun. However, can the Germans even afford it? Every side is running low on manpower at this point. We've decided to move, as we think they may have headed south. We'll be leaving soon. December 8th, 1916. I've been sitting in the infirmary for a while now. Everybody keeps asking me questions that I can't answer. However, I suppose that I should write down what happened, even if I don't fully understand it myself. We moved later that day, not wanting to risk getting caught in the darkness. We must have trudged across the snowy plains for hours. We also had limited visibility, barely being able to see just meters in front of us. The only thing that we had were the directions coming from our general. A great amount of time later, we started hearing the shrieking. I don't speak in exaggeration when I say that it was no sound of this earth. Like the villager had described, the sources of the ungodly noises didn't seem to move. They were all around us, but didn't even seem to shift in position or tone. And of course, we couldn't see anything. Everywhere we looked, we were met with walls of white. We started getting shot at only a few moments later. We all returned fire, but without any indication of where anybody was. We were essentially shooting blind. The incredibly worrying part was that our enemy didn't seem to share this problem. With no protection of the trenches, we were going down at an alarming pace. However, the assault eventually ceased. The shrieking had dissipated as well, thinking that this meant the enemy was severely wounded and retreating. We pressed further on into the blizzard. About a few more minutes of southbound movement, and we were bombarded again. The shrieking was also back now. We fired in every direction, trying to reload in between magazines as quickly as we could. However, our hands were so frozen that we couldn't retaliate quickly enough. We were soon down from 30 to about 12. In the midst of the carnage, I could make out a shape slowly staggering towards us through the snow. I must have emptied my entire clip into the entity, but it wouldn't go down. The thing continued to make its way towards us. Despite now being fired at by all our men, we could see chunks of its flesh being ripped off, but it never seemed to be bothered. As it got within about 10 meters of our formation, it stopped, and we could see it clearly. I suppose that you could call it human, but just barely. It was a man, stripped of all clothing, with skin that was charred to blackness all over, except for the face. That is, his face was normal enough. It had a few bullet wounds in the temple. The man squatted down in front of us and began to grin, gesturing for us to come forward. I glanced at my fellow soldiers, and they all shared the same look of sheer terror as I probably did. At this point, the gunshots had ceased, but none of us dared to move towards the strange man. We stood there for what felt like hours, before the man's grin faded and was instead replaced with an expression of sheer hatred. He opened his mouth wide and started shrieking. This time, it was so loud that we had to all cover our ears. It felt like our brains would explode if we didn't. I turned away for a second, looking back to see the man running away from us at a speed that should have been too fast for any normal human. But he was obviously not a normal human. We decided to turn back that instant. There was no way in hell that we were following that abomination of humanity into whatever gruesome fate it wanted to lead us into. We made the immensely difficult trek backwards, only to come across something that was definitely not there before. There were now pikes lodged into the ground, impaling German soldiers through the mouth. However, against all logic, they were still alive, flailing their arms and making desperate eye contact with us. We considered helping them, but there was really nothing we could have done. This was because the burnt man was also back, now standing at the bottom of one of the pikes. Again, he started motioning for us to come towards him. I couldn't stand the sight of him, so I turned around. However, as soon as I did, the gunshots came back. I tried my best to avoid both the human and the bullets as I started running frantically through the snowy hell, trying to return back to the world that I knew. As grim as conventional warfare is, this was something else entirely. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself in another village where I was taken in. I couldn't locate the rest of my team, and as shameful as it sounds, I didn't really care. I was out of there, away from the gunfire, away from the shrieks, away from that man. Eventually, I was found and put in the infirmary for treatment. I was suffering from severe hypothermia as well as 3 bullet wounds. There was only one member of my unit who made it back with me. However, he was catatonic, unable to provide the officers with any semblance of what had happened to us. It's not that I was able to fare much better. I couldn't begin to describe the events that had just transpired either. In fact, I don't really want to think about it anymore. December 19th, 1916. I'm back in my own home now, being deemed unable to continue on in the war. I've just been informed that we've won the Battle of Verdun. It's a sad victory for me. As much as I'd love to keep serving my country, I just can't risk running into that man again. You see, on my last day in the infirmary, I saw him. He was walking amongst the troops, but it was unquestionable. I'd never forgotten that face. He looked like a regular man due to the fact that he seemed to have gained his skin back somehow. But I know better than that. It's all just a trick. I tried telling my superiors about it, but they wouldn't listen. They think I'm insane. Maybe I am. But in any sense, I'm not going back out there. That thing is waiting for me. Back in its early days, the Jaws ride was infamous for constantly breaking down. It seemed like the thing was closed due to one thing or another almost every single day. Most people would assume that these closures were due to high technical, groundbreaking nature, but the real reason is more disturbing than you can imagine. Rumors of dark things happening at the ride go all the way back to before it had officially opened. The developers needed to bring in some underwater technicians to work on the various aspects of the shark in order to give it more realistic movement. Upon diving down to work on the track, a dive crew was assembled and tasked to solder a few new solenoids onto the shark. However, for an unexplained reason, the ride's power was turned on while they were still working on it, causing them all to be electrocuted. Their bodies floated there for at least an hour before anyone realized they were actually humans and not just props. This was the first in a series of many horrific occurrences that happened at the ride. Shortly after it opened, rumors began to surface about strange things occurring behind the scenes of the ride. One of the first trained team leaders began making these weird claims that a foggy haze would follow his boat just above the water whenever he would do the show. The issue was checked into by maintenance techs and other members of management, but no one was able to find any gas leaks or anything else like that would explain the anomaly. Then in December of 1991, the skipper said the fog came up onto his boat and was breathed in by him and several of the guests, causing him to do an emergency evacuation of the ride. Within a month of the incident, all of the individuals who had inhaled it, including the skipper, died tragic, unexpected deaths. The captain's was the most disturbing though. He was found later that week floating in the water of the Jaws ride after coming in one night after closing. Police ruled it was a suicide, considering all the wounds appeared to be self-inflicted. Although he had no history of depression, and everyone who knew him claimed he was a very happy, positive person. After just a short closure though, the ride again reopened and the story was basically forgotten. Then there's the report of the guest in 1992 who, after getting on the Jaws ride, randomly decided to jump out of the boat. All along, he just kept screaming that it was his time to see the light and various other religious sayings. As the boat's guest viewed him struggling in the water, the shark surfaced nearby. Strangely, it seemed as if it wasn't on a track anymore and that it was coming straight for him. Finally, after another guest grabbed him, the man began to climb back into the boat. That was when the shark shot forward and bit down on his leg, cutting into him deeply. The man screamed as the jaws chomped up and down, then backed away silently. It just froze, staring in at the boat for a few seconds, as if analyzing the guest with hungry eyes. It then slowly sank beneath the water, not to bother them again. The man was taken to the ER shortly after, but he ended up passing away from the loss of blood. This triggered management to do some more safety testing. However, after repeatedly doing cold run-throughs, they were not able to find evidence as to why this happened. In the end, they simply just assumed that it was some sort of mass hysteria and that the guest had just unluckily fallen into the shark's path. The ride was then back up and running within another week. However, this time, it seemed that the employees were much more aware of what was happening, and essentially everyone started to transfer away from the ride. Guests also began complaining because it seemed like all the employees had pretty much checked out. Many of them would even make dark jokes to the guest during the show about how the shark would probably get them someday, like it did with that guest not too long ago. It was an interesting time to have ridden the ride. So management decided that the only way to fix the problem was to clean house and hire a whole new team, making sure ahead of time that they had no knowledge of the event that occurred. That's when the real chaos began to ensue. One day a skipper named Jason started complaining about a strange whisper he would hear while he was giving the tour. At first, the voice was just telling him things about the ride and how to operate the boats properly, but he was really freaked out regardless. Working at that ride had always been a dream of his, so he wasn't willing to leave, but he knew he had to take some kind of action. So he started seeing a psychiatrist and was put on a few different kinds of medication. They didn't seem to help though. Actually, it was like they made him more aware of the voice. Feeling that he wasn't crazy though, he ended up doing some research and found various historical documents that led him to information about the land which Universal had purchased back in the 80s. According to several different sources, there had been documented tribes of Timucua Indians that lived in the area, and there was a possibility they had sacred burial sites there as well. Jason tried to tell his other co-workers about it, but found that no one really took him seriously. He eventually informed management, hoping they would do something, but nothing really happened with that either. So he pretty much gave up and just hoped for the best. Although, after discovering the things he did, it seemed that the whisper began to take a more sinister tone. It started to tell him that his coworkers thought he was crazy, and that everyone would be better off if he just ended it all. His psychiatrist became extremely disturbed by the things Jason was saying, but by the time anything was done about it, it was too late. One day, when Jason was doing the show, He crashed them straight into one of the explosion effects that occurred during the ride. All the guests on the boat died, including Jason, and the only thing officials really have to go on about his motive was a note that was left on the break room table with a cryptic sentence on it. It just said, "The demon must be free." It is not known how many more occurrences like this happened before the ride's eventual closure in the 2000s. However, it's safe to assume that the reason they closed was at least in part to prevent more of these things from happening. After the closure, most of the people who knew about the Jaws ride curse assumed it ended when the ride was demolished. A few years ago, the ride was replaced by Harry Potter's Escape from Gringotts, which is an attraction that coincidentally also has become infamous for breaking down all the time. This leads me to believe that perhaps the darkness in that area isn't gone after all, like everyone thought, and perhaps it's only just begun. It was just one of those stupid internet things, you know? Like an urban legend or creepypasta ritual or something. Except this one had some merit to it. There was an actual study, a scientific explanation, some genuine evidence behind it. It wasn't some supernatural phenomena. It was your brain, your very own wonderful mind, just fucking with you. I think that's the part that intrigued me the most. The chance to experience something truly disturbing, all while knowing that it was merely a visual illusion. For those of you who have never heard of the illusion, it's pretty simple. All you need is a dimly lit room, a chair, and a mirror. The chair should be placed 15 inches from the mirror, and light, preferably a dim lamp with a bulb no stronger than 25 watts, which should be behind the chair. All you have to do is sit down, stare at your own reflected face, and within a minute or so, you should start noticing the bizarre face illusion. According to the study, there's a whole mixed bag of freaky shit you can expect to see. Deformations in your own face, your parents' faces with changed traits, an unknown person's face, animal faces, even monstrous demonic things. At the time, I wasn't sure what I saw, but it fucked me up good. It took me a while before I realized anything that had happened at all. I guess maybe the changes were so gradual, so vague, that my eyes couldn't quite catch what was going on. But when I did notice, in that indescribable moment of horror, I instinctively kicked the mirror, fell back in my chair, and knocked over the lamp. The mirror fell on top of me, the lamp broke, and I was flailing on the floor, screaming hysterically. It took me hours to calm down, but I couldn't fathom why. I didn't even remember what I saw. My reflected face had been all shadowy and blurry, only vaguely familiar, kind of like a fuzzy memory. All of a sudden, I must have seen something bad, something so shocking that my fight or flight instinct kicked in, so horrible that my mind locked the memory of it away. Whatever it was, I swore I'd never do it again. I tried it fucked me up, and I was ready just to move on from there. Find something else, something safer. Maybe spend a night in a haunted house or something. Get my adrenaline rush from somewhere else than the depths of my own twisted subconscious. I went to work the next day feeling like shit. I guess we all feel that way about our jobs to some extent. But this was something else, something deep, hidden anxiety, a veiled sensation of dread or something. But after a couple of calls from some really obnoxious clients, it all sort of faded away, replaced instead by a sweet and familiar discontempt for humankind as a whole. At lunch, I sat down with Brandon and Joy, the office couple. They were decent people, I guess, a bit too cheery for my taste, but I didn't really mind. After a dozen or so less than satisfied conversations with unbelievable toxic clients, I could even use some cheery. "Are you okay, Ken?" Joy asked cheerily. "You look a little worse for the wear. He does, doesn't he? Brandon chimed in. Rough night, buddy? I feigned a smile and nodded. Yeah, I'm good. I lied. Just, Mondays. I don't exactly know what happened next. I vaguely remember Brandon and Joy talking about curtains, shoes, shelves. Something boring. I guess I must have zoned out at some point, because the next thing I remember is my half-full glass of milk shattering on the floor. I instantly snapped out of my trance and started apologizing profusely, awkwardly bending down to collect the shards. I'm sorry, I can be so clumsy. I think I muttered as I sat back up, placing the remnants of the broken glass on the empty plate. Brandon and Joy didn't say anything. They were sitting perfectly still, eerily still, staring at me in wide-eyed shock, or fear, or both. Jesus Christ, Ken, Joy stammered incoherently. Don't move. Brandon, we need to get you to the hospital, Brandon yelled, right now. I was confused, my gaze darting back and forth between the two of them. They looked genuinely upset, even scared, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why. What's wrong? I asked, blood now pouring out of my mouth. I can't say how I didn't notice before, but at the moment, I became painfully aware. I could feel the razor-sharp shard with the tip of my tongue. A long, thin piece of glass sticking through my right cheek. I gently pulled at it, resulting in the jagged edges slowly cutting through even more of my flesh. It's not so bad, I mumbled. Just a flesh wound. Brandon and Joy freaked out, throwing chairs aside and yelling hysterically at each other. Brandon ran back and forth, like he didn't quite know what he was doing. Get the car. Joy just kept shouting at him. She was awkwardly trying to lift me up, tugging violently at my shirt. It was white when I sat down, I remember thinking. Now it was a deep shade of red. At some point, I just stood up and started walking, a frantic Joy at my side, trying her very best to steer me in the direction of the car. I tried to calm her down, smiling reassuringly when she asked me if I was okay, but it didn't really seem to help. The drive to the hospital was quiet and peaceful. Brandon and Joy were probably scared senseless, and I just found myself thinking about what had happened. There was no way it was an accident. Like, how? Did I bend down and scrape my face against the floor? No, there was only one explanation that made any sense. I must have stabbed myself, but I couldn't remember doing it. Couldn't remember anything. Whatever really happened, Brandon and Joy and the doctors treated it like some freak accident. They didn't ask me questions, just did their best to comfort me and patch me up. There were a lot of stitches. Can't remember how many. There'd be a scar, though, they told me. Couldn't be helped apparently. They kept me in the hospital overnight. I guess they wanted to keep an eye on me or something. Brandon and Joy assured me they'd pick me up first thing in the morning. I'd be fine, they said. I just shrugged and smiled. I would have thanked them, but I had a hard time moving my mouth. I slept fairly undisturbed. There were some weird dreams, but nothing too extreme, and I woke up in a rather dazed state, staring at a bowl of cereal neatly placed on a tray next to my bed. I was quite famished, so I immediately emptied it, munching happily on the squishy contents of it. Squishy. Sure, in retrospect, it didn't sound right at all. It didn't taste right either. That's the weirdest part, I think. I mean, I was munching away happily, all the while thinking this shit tastes horrible. And the texture of it, I don't know. It was like chewing on a leathery egg filled with vile, rotting liquid. But I didn't stop, not until the nurse came in, dropping her tray and started screaming bloody murder. I instinctively spat it out. It sort of rolled unsteadily on the floor for a while, before settling by the feet of the hysterical nurse. A half-chewed human eyeball. My half-chewed eyeball. I don't know if I recognized it, or if it was the pain, or the fact that I was half blind that tipped me off. But as soon as the realization hit me, I completely lost it, and all these strange, erratic thoughts started going through my head. How did it happen? Why did I eat my own eyeball? What did it taste like? Was it as bad as pineapple on pizza? Would I eat it again, given the opportunity? The nurse wouldn't stop screaming. I couldn't stop screaming. I stumbled down from my bed, backing away from the nurse and the eyeball rapidly. It was staring right at me, judging me, loathing me, hating me. It was the last thing I saw before I lost balance and tumbled clumsily out the window. My memory is a bit hazy, I'll admit, but I remember the ground coming closer and closer, and the all-consuming feeling of, this is it. This is where I die, half naked in the hospital parking lot, missing my right eyeball. What would my epitaph say? He seemed perfectly normal until he dug out his eyeball and ate it. I lost consciousness when my head struck a fence about halfway down. That's what saved me. Apparently it broke the fall. Only messed me up. Didn't kill me. I suppose I should be thankful. All in all, I was lucky. Just a dislocated jaw, a broken arm, a light concussion, and some missing teeth. 16 missing teeth, all on the right side. I was a mess, a fucking monster. I didn't want to look at myself in the mirror. Couldn't stand the thought of it. I could see it in their eyes, the loathing, the disgust, the repulsion. But I knew I had to do it eventually, so I did. All you need is a mirror, a chair, and a dim lamp. Just sit down and stare at your reflected face. After a minute or so, you'll start seeing it. See the illusion. Unless it isn't an illusion, then you'll just see the truth. I erupted in what I can only describe as a maniacal laughter, my disfigured, monstrous visage twisting horribly in masochistic insanity. As the reflection slowly started changing, I kept laughing, couldn't stop laughing. The pain was unbearable. My stitches tore, blood pouring into my horribly damaged mouth. Long after, my reflection changed to a terrified, wide-eyed, shocked version of my once handsome self. I kept laughing. Only after he disappeared, taking the mirror with him, could I finally stop. It was such a simple, unremarkable scenario. I was sitting alone on the beach, drinking a gin and tonic mixture out of a Sprite bottle. It's what I like to do after work on Wednesdays. This was my idea of fun, apparently. Call it midweek escape. Like I've stated, it was an ordinary day. So ordinary and uneventful, in fact, that I ended up dozing off at some point. When I woke up, the sun was already setting. A lot of people don't know this, but the sun actually goes down relatively early in LA. A little after 8 p.m. to be exact. I looked at my phone, which had miraculously not been stolen at that point. 8:05. It was late, but not time to head home just yet. The place was rather calming at night, when the overwhelming crowd noise was replaced by the distant city din and the moonlight begins reflecting off the water. It really does feel somewhat serene. 9 p.m. I'd leave at 9. At 8:50, I decided to get up and start walking across the shoreline. The cool water brushing over your feet was a good feeling after having them on the hot sand for hours. As I was walking, I noticed something shiny just ahead of me. When I got over there, it became apparent that it was just a label of a glass bottle reflecting the moonlight. People who threw trash into the ocean always pissed me off. I moved over there and fished it out, planning on throwing it out where it actually belonged, but it was obvious that this wasn't just somebody's empty soda bottle. There was a rolled up piece of paper stuffed inside. In addition to that, it seemed to be wrapped in reflective tape. That's why I saw it so easily. A message in a bottle. I thought it was cute. Since it was dark outside, I decided to take it under the streetlight before reading it. I mean, It was probably just a messy ramblings of an elementary age kid or something. At any rate, I suppose I thought it must have been interesting enough to take a look at it before tossing. But what I read put me into a state of absolute incredulity. This is what was written onto the paper. They were coordinates, a date and a time. But I suppose what scared me the most was the actual message messily scrawled near the bottom. The man in black will be there, but please don't go. There was nothing on the ship. There was nothing. Of course, this was all extremely hard to decipher. It looked as if the person who wrote this was rushing hard. May 26th, 4 a.m. was the date written. That was today, I thought. Well, tomorrow actually, I suppose. I simply stared at the paper for the longest time, trying to make out some kind of determination regarding what the hell this was supposed to be. But what was I supposed to think about this? A part of me wanted to simply forget about it. I mean, why should I care about some obscure message I found floating around in a bottle in the ocean? But there was another part of me, the part that leads people into making bad decisions. We don't always fear the unknown. Sometimes we're just curious about it. That's why I didn't stop there. I called up one of my buddies, Killian, who I knew would be interested, and told him all about it. At first, he tried accusing me of writing the message myself in an attempt to trick him into this. That's the stupidest shit I've heard in my life, I remember telling him. Eventually, he relented. I guess he realized that his accusations were absurd. At around 3:30 a.m., we began heading over to the address. It wasn't necessarily in a bad part of town. It was just in a relatively deserted part. The address seemed to correspond to a small, abandoned strip mall that looked ready to be completely torn down. We parked all the way down the street, using nearby woods as cover as we made our way towards it. Eventually, we found ourselves directly across from the place, peeking at it through the thick bushes. In retrospect, this all should have seemed so childish. I mean, we were like kids spying on something restricted to us. However, we never questioned it at the time. The whole situation began feeling so weird. The sensation of wrongness and ambiguous terror began mounting every second. I could tell that Killian was feeling the same way, but none of us ever said anything, so we just waited to see what would happen. To our moderate surprise, a car pulled up on the other side of the street at exactly 4 a.m. We watched as what we assumed to be the man hopped out. Now, it was dark, so we couldn't really make out the intricacies of his outfit, but he was probably in some kind of dark suit. What's even weirder was that his face seemed obscured somehow. What I mean is that some of the moonlight should have illuminated at least some of his features. At one point, he even glanced in our direction for a few moments, but his face simply seemed to comprise of nothingness. At the time, we just chalked it up to the night. We simply couldn't see his face because it was dark outside. I mean, that made sense, right? However, the man stopped moving right after that. And I mean, he stopped. He was just standing, deathly still by his vehicle. This went on for what felt like an hour. In reality, it was only about 25 minutes. But still, who the fuck gets out of their car at 4 a.m. and stands still for 25 minutes? Even weirder was the fact that he didn't seem to be breathing. I mean, you could try standing still as possible, but you can never be completely motionless, you know? Your chest would have to puff out intermittently, even slightly, from inevitable exhalation. But he wasn't doing that. It's as if we were staring at a cardboard cutout. At some point, it became less creepy and more disconcerting. Now, I've never heard about somebody passing out while standing up, but I suppose that strange things have happened. Killian says that we should go and see if the guy is okay. I called him a madman after a brief argument. we hear something that breaks the silence. Footsteps. The guy is walking towards one of the stores in the strip mall now. Upon realization of this, we simply stare after him in sheer bewilderment. So what the fuck was he just doing? Even after the man has disappeared into the building, we still keep waiting. We weren't ballsy enough to follow him inside, but we also weren't scared enough to leave yet. We were at some kind of shitty middle ground. But after about 10 minutes, we realized that we have no idea what the hell this guy's actually doing in there. This meant that waiting for him to come out could be an overnight process. But I was getting tired. Working the next morning didn't start until noon for me, but I still needed at least some rest. We were about to leave when the blood-curdling female scream nearly makes my heart explode. It was coming from the building. We were in shock for the first few seconds, so we don't take immediate action. It's when the subsequent scream jolts us back into reality where we decide to call 911. But what the hell are we gonna tell them? Killian asks me. Hell if I know, I responded. But we gotta do something, right? We call the police and the operator tells us that somebody will be over within the next 20 minutes. But the situation starting to seem more and more urgent. Please, help me now. Somebody calling out now, and it sounds like they're in pain. Fuck it, I hear Killian mutter under his breath. He pulled a pistol out of his wristband. Come on, cops are slow. Yeah, well I don't have a gun, asshole. Fine, then stay here. Before I can stop him, he gets up and starts bolting towards the mall. I realize that I need to make a decision within the next split second, so I run after him. Although he was an impulsive idiot, I didn't want to see him wind up dead. Besides, I was pretty sure that he had no idea how to shoot that thing. I caught up to him just as he was stepping through the entrance. The screaming and pleading was still going on, so we kept going deeper down the hallway. However, we had no idea where to go. Wait, why couldn't we figure out where to go? The answer soon became obvious. The screaming had maintained the same volume ever since we entered. We couldn't tell where it was coming from. Hell, I'm inclined to believe that the screaming was still as loud as when we heard it from the forest. I think Killian realized this at the same time I did. He dropped his gun for a second, and I could hear his breathing tighten. It was the exact moment where the screaming ceased altogether. Instead, it was replaced by a steady, rhythmic set of footsteps. But just like the screaming, we couldn't tell where it was coming from. Trying to create a better sense of direction in this sudden claustrophobic space, I fumbled around in my pocket for my phone. Eventually, I got it out and turned the flashlight on. There was nobody in our perceptible vicinity, although I could still hear the footsteps. I mean, it sounded like they were coming from everywhere. At some point, I managed to illuminate what appeared to be a message carved into the wall. Why are you following me? And then suddenly, we could see him. What I could only assume was the man in black. He was wearing a suit, black blazer, black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. But I couldn't see his face. Not in the same sense he was wearing a mask though. In the place of where his face should have been, there was nothing. I could see his ears and dark, slick-back hair, but his features were absent, covered by some kind of endless, empty space. It's hard to actually describe, but that's the closest depiction that I could have came to. I could hear gunshots from behind me. Killian was shooting at him. However, the bullets simply seemed to be consumed by the void, taking up the man's head. The man lunged forward, but I managed to get out of the way just in time. Problem is, Killian was standing right behind me. With seemingly inhuman strength, the man hastily grabbed and began dragging him down the hall. I went after them, of course, but it seemed as if the two had quickly vanished into thin air. No more screaming, no more sounds of struggle, and no more footsteps. I was left standing there, petrified to the core. It wasn't long after that until the police showed up. I told them what I saw. I have a feeling that they didn't believe me. I was questioned extensively, but that yielded minimal closure. They searched the entire place, but didn't find his body. They didn't find any bodies, in fact. Killian was declared missing. They tried to stick me with something, but ultimately couldn't. I mean, I didn't do it, after all. The fucking man in black did. However, they found him about 3 weeks later. Killian, he was in the forest, clothing tattered and eyes bloodshot. They could barely get a coherent story out of him. He simply kept saying that the man in black took him somewhere terrible, that he would wake up in the woods every night, and that a strange woman would keep beckoning for him to come inside her cabin. He would try running away from her, but the man in black would always be in his way. In short, he'd gone insane. He wouldn't even talk to me when I'd go see him. His crazed ramblings cease when I'm in the room, and he refuses to make eye contact. I'm writing this because the man in black is still after me. I came home one night to see my bathtub full. I only ever shower. I haven't used it in years. There was a bottle floating on the top of the water, a bottle with a message in it. This time, it contained only a singular phrase: "You follow me, and I'll follow you."